Hi class, welcome back to Business Statistics. This is section 2.2, Summarizing Qualitative Data. We're going to cover an example of a frequency table for quantitative data. And this is to go to section 2.2. Some of the topics that you would have already covered or you should be covering if you're watching this video, you can find in the PowerPoint slides or on the Learn Smart Achieves or in the ebook. But some of that would be the definition of raw data, the definition of a frequency distribution to summarize quantitative data, and then these main components of a frequency distribution. So classes, class limits, class boundaries, class midpoint, class width, and then the definition and purpose of a histogram. Okay, and so the histogram is, obviously just going to be the visual, graphical representation of a frequency table for a quantitative, for quantitative data, for a quantitative frequency table. So let's go ahead and get into it. One thing I do also want to note that on the class boundaries, class midpoint, class width, the reason that I am covering this, one, the book covers it, or this whole Business Statistics McGraw-Hill product covers this. And so then there might be questions that come up in your Learn Smart Achieves, or that potentially come up in the quizzes that deal with these concepts. But know that for class limits, class boundaries, and class midpoint, class limits, class boundaries, class midpoint, and class width, I'm not going to be covering those topics specifically. Now, that doesn't mean you don't need to understand kind of on the whole what those are. It just means you're not going to get a question on a test that says, what is the class midpoint of phone bill class limits 0 to 15? I'm not going to ask you that. I don't think that it's important to be tested on. I just think that we have bigger fish to fry, okay? So without any further ado, let's get started on 2.2, Summarizing Quantitative Data. Following deregulation of telephone service, several new companies were created to compete in the business of providing long-distance telephone service. One long-distance telephone company wanted to acquire information about the monthly bills of new subscribers in the first month after signing with the company. The company's marketing manager conducted a survey of 200 new residential subscribers where the first month's bills were recorded. Form a frequency table which the general manager plans to use to present his findings to senior executives. Frequency distribution of the first month's bill is as such. Okay, so we're looking at this, and what it gives us are class limits. So these phone bills class limits, and it gives us the frequency. So what we saw in the last video in 2.1 was we made a frequency table out of qualitative data, and now we're making it out of quantitative data. So the qualitative data was the colors. They asked what your favorite color was. So that's a variable that doesn't have a particular order, is not a number, just going to be classed in some capacity, okay? So making a frequency table out of quantitative data kind of turns it into a qualitative variable in a sense, because we're taking some of the numerical nature out of it by just lumping it into groups here, okay? But so that's what kind of makes it a little bit easier to use our frequency tables in this regard. So what we have now, in the last example, we counted up the data and we put those in the table ourselves. In this one, we already have that data counted up, so we don't have this big mess of raw data that we're having to count up on our own and then put into classes. So we're assuming we're already at a point where we can that we have everything into its particular frequencies, okay? All right, so what I'm going to show you, and I think I already mentioned this, but What I'm going to show you is how to calculate the class midpoint. Like I said, this is not something I'm going to test you on, but in case that it shows up in a Learn Smart Achieve or in one of your Learn Smart quizzes, I do want you to know how to do it, okay? But again, not going to be on the midterm exam or anything like that, okay? So here's how we calculate a class midpoint. So that's what this midpoint is for. So all we're doing here is we're trying to find the midpoint of this class, okay? So as you can see, maybe intuitively you already know, well, the midpoint between 0 and 15, well, it's not going to be a whole number. It's going to be 7.5. So that's just the midpoint. Okay, the way that we actually go about calculating that, though, just in case, you know, it might come easy to you. You might just already know. But the actual way that we would go about calculating it is the upper limit, okay, so 15, minus the lower limit, okay, 0, divided by 2, so that you can have the space, okay? And then we're going to be adding that to the lower limit, 0. So in the 15 minus 0, we get 15, divided by 2, we get 7.5. So it ends up being 7.5 plus 0, or just 7.5. Okay? So this is our class midpoint for this, you know, I guess we can call it class number 1. Okay? Class number 2. If you want to number them, fine. Okay, so the secondary one that we would do is we would do the 16 to 30 class, okay? Maybe I'll try to do this math inside here. We'll see if that works. So then we just say 30 minus 16, okay, divided by 2, plus 16, the lower limit. And what is that going to give us? So 30 minus 16 is 14. So we have 14 on top of the fraction, okay? And divided by 2, it's going to be 7. Okay, so it's going to be 7 plus 16, and that equals 23. Okay, so we go down this whole thing, and we can do this formula over and over and over again. And these are the numbers that we get. So I'll invite you to go ahead and actually work out those formulas and just make sure that you are getting these numbers. So again, these midpoints are going to be the midpoints in the classes. Okay? So you're basically just taking whatever that size of that class is, whatever that spans, half of that. Okay? And so you're just trying to find the midpoint, just the right smack dab in the middle of the class. Okay? So you're taking the top minus the bottom, dividing it by 2 to get half of that length. And then you're adding that to the bottom side. You could also just subtract it from the top side if you wanted to. Okay, so that's that. So that's how you're getting the class midpoint. And then another thing that you might be asked on a within a Learn Smart Achieve is the class boundaries. Okay, and this is kind of a similar concept. In that what you're doing is you just want to split the difference now between the class limit, the upper bound of the previous class, and the lower bound of the next class in order to get class limits, and vice versa, okay? So these would be tied together, and these would be tied together. Okay, you'll see what I mean here in a second. So on the ends, it's not going to matter. Let me find my pen. There's my pen. Okay, so a class bound for this one, we're going to start out with 0. And then what we're going to do is we're going to split the difference between the class limits that are next to each other. So the upper bound of class number 1 is 15. Okay, and the lower bound of class number 2 is 16. So we just want to meet at the midpoint between those two, okay? And so that's going to be 15.5. Okay, so these are class boundaries. And so then we go down here, and then this one we know is going to be 15.5. Okay, and we do the same thing right here. So that's going to be 30.5. We're just splitting the difference between these. Okay, so we go over here. Sorry, my pen is not working correctly here. So 30.5, which I'm just going to type this in. So this would be 45.4 to 60.5. This would be 60.5 to 75.5. This would be 75.5 to 90.5. This would be 90.5 to 105.5. And then lastly, 105.5 to 120.5. So all you're doing is you're splitting the difference between the upper bound of the previous class and the lower bound of the succeeding class. And so because these bounds are just separated by 1 unit, you can just add a half unit or subtract a half unit depending on which bound you're looking at. And then I believe is that one. Sorry, we missed that one. That one is 30.5 to 45.4. Oh, 45.5, sorry. Great. Well, I hope this clears up any questions that you had in regards to midpoint and class boundaries. Thanks so much, guys, and tune in for section 2.3. And that's just going to be a brief introduction to summation notation. Thanks so much.